Alrighty. So, what we're going to look at, we are beginning part 2 of Unit 4. So, Unit 4 is the progressive era or the progressive presidents. We've already looked at in part 1, we looked at Teddy and Tubby. Part 2, we're going to look at Woodrow Wilson. So, first of all, why did I cram 2 presidents into part 1 and only we're looking at part 2 for one president? I think arguably, we probably could have spent a lot more time on Teddy Roosevelt, but there's only so much time we have available. And the Woodrow Wilson unit or part is going to be important leading into part 3, which is World War One. Woodrow Wilson, now, I want to be very clear about this. I think most of you are aware, I do not like Woodrow Wilson, and it is hard for me to be objective about him because of it. I would I generally, if people ask me who I think the worst presidents ever are, he is in my top 5. And unlike somebody like James Buchanan or Ulysses S. Grant or Warren Harding, it's not because Wilson didn't do stuff. It's because precisely he did things, and because realistically he's a horrible human being. I want to lay that out there to begin with. So, a little bit of background about Woodrow Wilson, your 28th president. Woodrow Wilson was a Southern Democrat. He was born in Virginia. He was born on a plantation. His family owned slaves. Now, this is where the sort of like background of Wilson, I think, really affects a lot of who he is. Wilson's dad was a minister, he was a preacher, he was an abolitionist preacher. But wait, you just said he owned slaves. Yeah, he did. Because see, here's the thing. What Daddy Reverend Wilson discovered was that his congregation was primarily made up of rich slave owning planters. They didn't want to hear about abolition. And he was not doing well financially and personally with his message of abolition. So he switched his position on slavery for his own economic benefit. He bought slaves, and Wilson grew up in a household where until he was like early teen, like middle school age, he had slaves, and he never got past this part. Wilson was a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. Um, I'm not going to say he was a member of the Klan. There's no evidence to that, but he was a huge supporter of them, and he justified the Klan throughout his life. And even during his presidency, he had visitors from at the White House who were Klansmen. He gave his endorsement to America's first great motion picture epic, Birth of a Nation, which is an incredibly skewed piece of political garbage that puts forward that the Ku Klux Klan really are the only noble thing that came out of the Civil War, and that the Klan is what's going to restore America. Um, Wilson was not only okay with this, he supported it. He gave his endorsement to it. He felt that every American should see that movie. Also, um, his his background of owning slaves really helped form the fact that Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist. He believed that there were just too many people in the world, especially of certain kinds, like non white people and poor white people, and that they should be gotten rid of and not be allowed to have children because their children would prove to be inferior. And he was a big supporter and believer of this, and he pushed it a lot. Big departure from Teddy and Taft, who actually supported civil rights and worked for it to some degree or another, or at least tried to create an environment where civil rights would happen. Now, I am going to give some props here to Wilson. As a child, Wilson suffered from a severe form of dyslexia, and at the time, nobody really knew what it was, and there was no professional way to deal with it. Wilson taught himself how to overcome dyslexia and read. But it was at the expense of his future hopes and dreams. He wanted to be a lawyer, and he simply could not do law school. So he turned to the next best thing, I guess, and he became a history and political science professor. Now, Wilson's experience in the Civil War and his experience of the loss that his family had because of the war drew him to the conclusion that there was really something wrong with America itself. And the thing that was wrong was the way that the Constitution was set up and the idea of American style democracy. What Wilson really wanted was a legislative and executive branch that were combined. And it was his view that the presidency was limited only by the man who held it. If the guy who was president wanted to do stuff and thought he could, he should be able to. That really the president himself was the only limit on the power of the presidency. He felt the checks and balances and the separation of powers was bad for America, and that it really was preventing a better life for everybody. And ultimately, he believed that the Constitution had been set up by a group of wealthy elites who had created the government to ensure that they would never be deprived of their power, their property, and their influence. Now, the ironic part is that Wilson himself is not poor. He is upper middle class to upper class. But a lot of this is the effect of the loss of his family's property and everything else in the Civil War. And his belief that the Civil War had basically been brought about by a group of people who were attempting to use African Americans as a tool to suppress the South and, and really hold back Southerners. Now, ironically enough, with all this, Wilson's other belief was is that the government should be the source of all answers for everybody. It should be the government's job to make things better. He took very literally the promote the general welfare idea, that the government's job was to address problems. If there were problems in society, the government needed to fix them. The government had to push the welfare of everybody together, um, and that you needed to check or hold in check these wealthy elites to help everybody and their lives to be better. The government should use money to fix problems. Also, Wilson believed that there should be no private charity, no church charities, no like Hunger Task Force America, no Red Cross, nothing like that. That the government should be the source of all charity. This is going to need a lot of money, by the way, which we'll talk about later how this money is going to come around. He rose through the ranks of academia, eventually becoming a professor at Princeton and later becoming president of Princeton. His his ideas as president of Princeton began to filter their way through all of the Princeton social sciences, political science, and history, so that there was an entire generation of Americans who were being brought up with Wilson's views on government and on the role of government and on the Constitution. Now, in another area to give props to Wilson, reluctantly, but I will give props to this. Eventually, his notoriety at Princeton, and by the way, he published books and papers on his views, led him to be the Democratic selection for governor of New Jersey, a position that he won. New Jersey was a train wreck of a state. It was a sinkhole of corruption and poverty. And Wilson more or less cleaned that up. He eliminated the corruption in the government and he spent tons of money to pull New Jersey out of poverty. And his ideas, at least to some degree at a small level, worked. This is what brought him to the attention of the Democratic Party as a whole across the country. Now, let's fast forward slightly. And oops, did I skip something? I did. Sorry. Why it is that Wilson was selected by the Democrats in 1912. Going into the election of 1912, the Democrats were all set again to nominate Cross of Gold man William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan was the big Democratic candidate again. The problem was going into the convention, he simply did not have over 50% of the delegates to vote for him and to support him. What ended up happening was is that Bryan, maybe after losing 3 times and basically 4 times, decided that fifth time wasn't going to be a charm. After talking with Woodrow Wilson, Bryan threw his support and his delegates behind Woodrow Wilson. Now there's a couple of reasons for this, but the primary one is that Woodrow Wilson promised William Jennings Bryan that if elected, that he would create a public banking system for the United States. Now remember, whenever we see the word public, right here, public, the word public is another way of saying government. Public schools are government schools. Public health care is government health care. Public transportation is government transportation systems. So, what Wilson promised was that if elected, he would create a public bank for America because he believed that private banks were dangerous. They were dangerous for Americans and they were dangerous for progress because without the government controlling it, the banks didn't necessarily have to give you money or spend money on stuff that he felt should be spent on. It also probably didn't hurt that he kind of sort of gave William Jennings Bryan a cabinet position, which we'll talk about. Now, in many respects, Woodrow Wilson is the um, is the ideal or perfect Democratic candidate. He is a hardcore bigoted Southerner who is a governor of a northern state. He doesn't act Southern. He doesn't talk Southern. He's all highfalutin and educated. He did reform New Jersey, so he's got success and credibility doing that. And what was really good about Wilson as a candidate was, unlike Bryan, who no matter what you wanted to talk about would always come back to that whole cross of gold thing, Wilson was really, really well educated on a variety of subjects, and he was a gifted speaker in terms of shifting conversations to where he wanted them to go. He could change topics and get you to talk about what he wanted you to talk about and avoid talking about the things that were controversial or touchy. Now, another thing that Wilson is all about, that the Bryan and progressive Democrats are for, that really goes along with public banking, is wealth redistribution. Wealth redistribution is the idea that you take money away from one group of people and you give it to another group of people. So, who has money? The rich. You take it away from the rich and you make sure that it goes to everybody. But isn't that a good thing that everybody has money? Yeah, but here's the problem. If you discourage wealthy people from making more money by taking it away from them, they're not going to make money. And those are the ones who are generating the wealth and income of America. Now, this whole approach to things, this excuse me, this wealth redistribution is really symptomatic of a bigger issue, which is Wilson's view that private property was not as important as public welfare and public good. If it was necessary, the government could and should take away your private property for what they want to do. If your house is in an area where the government wants to build a park, the government should be able to take your house and build its park. And in order to do that, you needed to eliminate private banks because private banks are what are allowing you to have the money to prevent the government from doing stuff like this. This, by the way, this concept that the government takes away your, your personal stuff for what it wants is called eminent domain. It's a real thing. It's where the government can basically tell you how you can and cannot use your own personal property. Because ultimately, it's the view that your property, your rights, your very existence, and everything about you are dependent upon the government. The government should be involved in Wilson's mind of actively regulating banks to ensure that everybody has access to wealth and prosperity because private banking is preventing everybody from having it. So if you come in and you want to buy a house, but you have no money and you have no collateral, the bank is going to say no. But if the government forces the bank to, the government will say yes, which will give you the money to own a house. And isn't that better for everybody? Yeah, it is until you can't pay back that loan. Now, what Wilson wanted really should not have been a surprise to anybody who kind of paid attention to what was going on. Wilson's goals were actually outlined in a book. It believe it or not, is a work of speculative dystopian fiction. I say dystopian, but I suppose it'd be more accurate to say speculative fiction. That means like alternate history. Book is called Philip Drew, Administrator. It was published in 1912. Its author was a guy named Colonel, and I put that in quotes because he's not really a colonel. It was a nickname he got, kind of like Colonel Sanders, the guy who founded KFC. Colonel Edward M. House. Now, Philip Drew Administrator, which, by the way, if you are interested in reading it, it is available. It's still in print. You can easily get it from Amazon. You can probably get it used fairly cheap. I don't know where it is, but I actually have a copy of it somewhere. Philip Drew Administrator is a work of alternate history slash historical or speculative fiction, historical fiction, that puts forward an idea that in the early 20th century, a group of army officers overthrows the government of the United States because they discover that the government is corrupt and evil and that they've been using the Constitution to suppress the prosperity of the people. And they replace it with essentially a military socialist dictatorship under the leadership of an officer named Philip Drew. And that under Philip Drew's guidance, America becomes a socialist paradise and utopia where all people benefit and it's better for everybody. The book was published in 1912, anonymously, by the way. Edward House's name did not get attached to it, I think, until almost 1920. Now, why am I bringing this up? Edward House was one of Woodrow Wilson's closest friends and advisors. And he actually gave Wilson a copy of the book before it was published. Wilson devoured the book and literally based his entire presidency on the ideas put forward in the book. So, in a nutshell, what we're looking at here is an increase in the power of the executive. You reduce or remove the separation of powers, checks, and balances to minimize and shrink the other branches of government, leaving only a strong executive. You create a centralized bank. Its purpose is to control the nation's money supply. If you control the money, you control the country, you control the people. You have some form of wealth redistribution, which will allow the super wealthy elites, heck, let's call them what they would be called anyways, the bourgeois, to have their money taken away and shared among the less fortunate, the proletariat. Now, be very clear about this. What Woodrow Wilson is not advocating is socialism or communism. In fact, it's kind of on the opposite extreme, you would think. Wilson talked a lot about the need for a free market economy where entrepreneurs and businessmen could thrive and America would grow. This sounds great. What's the problem? How does that fit with any of this? Because you need to sort of look at the bigger picture with Wilson. It's all of what he wants. It creates an environment of dependency where people are more dependent on the government than on anything else. Those people are simply resources, they are commodities. They have value because they contribute to society. They contribute as taxpayers, they contribute as entrepreneurs, they contribute as laborers, they contribute as producers. When their value as a producer, as a laborer, as an entrepreneur, as a taxpayer, when they can no longer do that, they are used up and should be replaced. This and the market should be free so long as businesses and industries support the government. And everybody knows exactly who they are as a resource based on their identity as a group, their socioeconomic class, their skin color or background, their education level, their religious persuasion, maybe, um, their gender. Ultimately, what we are talking about here is a form of Marxism called fascism. Woodrow Wilson is a fascist. People will disagree with me on that, and I don't care. You're entitled to your wrong opinion. But this is what Woodrow Wilson wanted. He wanted a government where people were dependent on it, where they were simply resources to provide for that government, where a free market existed to prop up and support the government in its position, and where you accepted who you were based on your background and the group that you were the most closely associated with or put into. Now, during Wilson's time in office, there are four brand new amendments instituted to the Constitution, and we will talk about these each individually. And these four amendments, by the way, work towards his goals. The 16th Amendment, which established the federal income tax, that was wealth redistribution. The 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, the minimizing of the power of the states and giving that power more to the locality and more towards the central government. The 18th Amendment, which outlawed alcohol, a big cause of one particular identity group, the temperance movement. And last but not least, the 19th Amendment allowing women to vote. Again, an identity politics issue. Now, of these four amendments, only one of them is any good, the 19th Amendment, long overdue. These other three are horrible. And I have a hard time figuring out which of the three is actually the worst one. The 18th was so bad that it got removed eventually. But the 16th and the 17th are absolutely horrible, and they still plague us to this day. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, this is the end of part one. Peace and, or sorry, part. This is the end of lesson one of part two. Peace and love.